So today I would like to talk about two topics that I find very interesting and that are actually very relevant to the times. And that is debt and the monetary system or money overall. And I want to talk about this because debt levels worldwide, and especially in developed nations like the US, Japan, France, Italy, they're getting out of hand. And I want to quote Frederick Hayek here when he said that if socialists were understood economics, they wouldn't be socialists. And I think the same applies for government debt or government spending. If people actually understood what debt is and what government spending implies, they would not be cheering for it. The problem is that we have a lot of experts, people coming from central banks, high people from the government telling us that debt levels are fine, that they're completely sustainable, when they really are not. The thing is, most people are not even paying attention to the debt levels to government spending, or don't really understand the nature of it. But most importantly, most people don't really understand the nature of money. What is money? Where does money come from? Who gives it value? Who decides how much our money is worth? And those are questions that are very important to ask. And if we really understood the nature of money, we would be much more cautious on how we approach debt levels and how we would relate to our government spending. And so I would like to talk about those two topics today and see how the current monetary system allows for governments to spend high amounts and to incur high levels of debt. We need to understand our money, our monetary system, and start asking these questions. So I wanna take a look at these two things, and I'm gonna focus on the US debt level, because there's this misconception with regards to the US that because it has a reserve currency, it can spend as much as it wants and get into as much debt as it wants because they can just print the money to pay it off. And that's very mistaken. And there's people like Ray Dalio, one of the most successful hedge fund managers ever, who are talking about the dangers of doing this.
The most important principle to keep in mind when thinking about large government debts and deficits, such as those that we have and that are coming, is when countries have too much debt, lowering interest rates and devaluing the currency that the debt is denominated in is the preferred path government policymakers are likely to take, so it pays to.
And I want to talk a little bit more about it. These are complex topics, so I'm going to try to simplify as much as I can while giving a good overview so that we can all understand how it works and what is going on. So to start, let's take a look at debt levels in the US. So the national debt level has increased every year under every president, regardless of whether they're Republican or Democrat, except in 2000 with Bill Clinton, who managed to achieve a budget surplus. But besides that, every year the debt keeps moving higher. Now the debt right now is at $37 trillion. It increased $32 trillion within 25 years. That's a lot. That means that every citizen owes about $110,000 and every taxpayer owes about $325,000. And of course, there's this idea that government doesn't really have to pay its debt, but it sort of has to eventually. And this debt is showing no indication of slowing down because deficits are still higher than economic growth. So the metric to take a look at here is what debt is as a percent of GDP. And that also is at record levels, because if at least the economy was growing at a faster pace, that would perhaps bring the debt to GDP levels lower, but it's not happening. So according to the experts, government spending is actually a good thing and it is going to help economic growth. That really is not happening, and that doesn't really happen after a certain threshold. According to some economists, that threshold is 80%, and right now it's sitting at 120%. But to understand why debt levels have gotten so out of hand and why it does have major implications for the economy, it's necessary to understand money and the current monetary system, because the change in monetary system in the 70s is what allowed the debt levels to get so high. So let's go back in time to the 1930s, which is when the system started evolving into what we have today. So before the 1930s, and I'm going to focus on the US, it operated according to the gold standard. So basically, during the gold standard, the US dollar was backed by gold, and there was convertibility. So that if you had $1,000, you could go to your local bank and you could exchange it for physical gold. So under the gold standard, which is the most important thing when it comes to debt, the government was not allowed to spend more than it had in reserves. So that if they wanted to spend $1 million, they had to back it up with gold reserves. That became very problematic for the government because they always want to spend more than they had. And it became problematic because it forced them to be fiscally responsible. So the 1930s came, it was a Great Depression, and FDR wanted to start and engage in very large spending programs. So he suspended domestic convertibility. So US citizens could no longer convert their money to gold anymore. And the government abandoned balanced budgets to finance large-scale projects. But they were still somewhat limited because international convertibility was still in place. That means foreign governments could still convert their dollars to gold if they thought the US government was spending too much, if spending was getting out of hand. So the government still had some restrictions in place to be fiscally responsible. That was until the 1960s when government started heavy spending on war and social programs. The government got involved in the Vietnam War, and on the side, they were financing very large-scale social programs. So that in August of 1971, President Nixon basically defaulted on the government's debt. Now, we're not told in school that the US government defaulted on its debt, but that's basically what happened. What happened is that spending outpaced gold reserves, and the government didn't really have enough reserves to pay off its debt. So in August of 1971, Nixon went off the gold standard entirely.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
That meant neither US citizens nor foreign governments or people abroad could convert their US dollars to gold anymore. And that was the start of the fiat system. That's the system that we have in place right now. So under a fiat system, money is no longer backed by gold, but by government's credibility. Under gold standard, paper money was really gold because it could be exchanged for gold at any time. When that changed to the fiat system, that stopped being the case. So money is no longer backed by gold, but it is backed by a government's credibility. So what's the problem? Before, when currencies were backed by gold, the money supply was limited, so prices remained stable. Money supply was generally stable because you cannot get gold out of thin air. You cannot print gold and create it out of thin air. So prices remain stable. Fast forward to today and the fiat system that we have, which is a type of government-issued currency that is not backed by anything. So governments are not forced to be fiscally responsible, and because they have the power to create money out of thin air, so to speak, they can increase the supply of money, which really means that they devalue the currency. So what happens when deficits are too high is that it leads to higher debt levels, and when governments cannot really afford or are unable to pay off their debt, they print money. So whereas before they had to get their hands on gold to pay off their debt, their go-to method today is printing money to pay it off. And here is Jerome Powell, chair of the Federal Reserve, simplifying it as
simply flooded the system with money.
Yes, we did. That's another way to think about it. We did.
Where does it come from? Do you just print it?
We print it digitally. So we as a central bank, we have the ability to create money digitally, and we do that by buying treasury bills or bonds or other government guaranteed securities, and that actually increases the money supply. We also print actual currency, and we distribute that through the Federal Reserve Bank.
That's why having high debt levels and high budget deficits is so dangerous, because it has to be paid off somehow, and the preferred method, and it is what governments did throughout COVID, is currency devaluation. aka money printing, which they can and often do because the currency is no longer backed by gold or other assets. So, in short, governments worldwide abandoned the gold standard because it was very inconvenient to them, because it forced them to be fiscally responsible. So by abandoning the gold standard, they could increase their spending levels and incur debt without having to face immediate consequences. The consequences take much longer to pan out. In the long term, currency printing or currency devaluation, which are basically synonyms, the preferred method to pay off debt, generates inflation and worsens the quality of life of everyday citizens. And that's why I believe if people really understand the nature of money and understood that money is no longer backed, or not even money, currencies are no longer backed by gold, maybe more people would understand the dangers of government spending and government debt, because we would all understand that to pay it off, the government is going to have to print money. And by printing money, they devalue our currency, which is really a synonym for inflation. So we have to be very careful with debt levels.